Y'all ready to be history?
It started.
Welcome.
Hi.
Hello, everyone.
To the Pro Audio Suite.
These guys are professional. They're motivated.
With Tech to the VO stars. George Whittam, founder of Source Elements. Robert Marshall, international audio engineer. Darren Robbo Robertson. And global voice, Andrew Peters. Thanks to Tribooth, Austrian audio, making passion heard. Source Elements, George The Tech Whittam, and Robbo and AP's international demos. To find out more about us, check theproaudiosuite.com.
Line up, ladies!
Here we go.
And welcome to the Pro Audio Suite, thanks to Tribooth. Don't forget their new model, the Tribooth Memo. It fits in half your carry-on luggage, perfect for travelling. And Austrian Audio, making passion heard. This week we're talking plugins, and we have a special guest, Matthew Kleinman from KIT Plugins, which is also a part of a company that's being developed now called NoiseHub. Anyway, Matthew, welcome.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
I'm glad you're here. Just want to talk a bit about KIT plugins. How did that start? Just to give us some background.
Yeah, absolutely. So I don't know if my story is unique or generic at this point in our industry, but I was a mix engineer by trade. Moved down to Nashville after I lived in New York growing up. Moved to LA like most of us do in the U.S. and then eventually found my way to Nashville, working for a fairly successful pop record producer here, and kind of cutting my teeth mixing his demos and his songs. And towards the end of my stint with him, we were doing quite well. I was mixing a lot of songs that were getting played a lot, but I was also starting to sour on the business side of the industry. Didn't really find that I was as passionate about it as I was when it was my hobby. And I did some soul searching and said, look, I don't want to leave music, but I don't want to make music for a living either. I want to make music for fun. And I came up with the idea that I wanted to start my own business. And the idea for KIT Plugins came in the form of my relationship with John McBride. So the producer I was working for rented studio space monthly from Blackbird. So we had a permanent studio in the back of the building, and I'd met John periodically through it. I didn't know him super well, but I had the connection. And most importantly, I had access through that rental to a lot of Blackbird's gear on the weekends. I could go into the studios that were empty and work on the consoles. And when I would travel and I had to use plugins, I didn't like what I was getting. I mean, I had a lot of the plugins from a lot of the major companies, and they're good, but they didn't sound like Blackbird. And I had kind of grown partial to it. So I went to John and I said, look, I want to start a business. I want to raise money from investors, and I want to build plugins out of your collection of gear. And that was it. There was no plan or idea at that stage, but I went to John. He said yes. And then I spent about a year sort of working backwards into, okay, well, actually, how am I going to do this? What does this look like? How much money do I need? Who do I need to hire? I'm not a software developer. I understand how plugins work. I understand how the gear works, but I can't write the code. So, I had to sort of back into it and learn on the fly. But it all started with the idea that I wanted, selfishly, Blackbird plugins on my laptop.
Wow.
And grew from there.
Because we were talking about this before we started recording, but Blackbird, I do remember when Slate Digital got going, they did do some emulations of Blackbird as well. So what is different about what you're doing as opposed to what Slate did?
Fundamentally, the only difference that matters to the end user, in my opinion, is what we model. So Blackbird with Slate had 3 products at the time. 2 were already out when I decided to start KIT. 1 had not come out yet, but they had created the drum pack, which I was already a user of, and they had created the microphone modeling for VMS, which I owned and was using. And at that time, the headphones, I think they're called VSX, they had not come out yet, but they were in the development process. They had already licensed Blackbird's control rooms for the headphone virtual mixing stage. But Slate had at the time, and as far as I know, there were never any plans to do any of the actual equipment, the consoles, the compressors, the reverb chambers. And that, for me, was what I wanted. I mean, the microphones were cool, but modeling microphones are only useful if you need to have just one microphone. And I was lucky enough in my situation that when I recorded vocals, I had access to the Blackbird mic locker. So I didn't need a model of a U67. I just grabbed a U67. I recognized like that was a privilege, and I very much appreciated it. But I selfishly, like I said, I wanted the Studio A recording console, because I would put every mix I could through that console. I wouldn't do anything to it. I'd mix the whole thing in the box and just dump it out onto the board. But that board just has a unique tone to it, and whether it's psychological or real doesn't really matter. It did something. I wanted, Martina's compressor, her Fairchild, and so when I approached John, the idea was basically, look, Slate did what he did. We're not going to do that. We're going to do totally different pieces of gear for the same audience, but different applications. And that's the real differentiator is we just did different things. And we don't have any plans at the moment of doing modeling microphones or anything like that. So,
well, you were saying that whatever it is the console does, it does something. Give us a little background on the console and, the topology. Was it based on or in any way related to some of the other, well-known builders of consoles at the time? What's special about it?
It's a Neves 8078? What is it?
8078 Neve.
Yeah.
And with 31105 modules in it. The thing that makes that console special, I mean, like any console, especially any Neve, there's always somebody famous recorded on it, some story, right? No one bought a Neve console and then didn't use it with someone famous. But I hope not. If you did, it was a bad investment.
Really bad investment, yeah.
But this particular one was with Fagan, and then John bought it. But this is really, for me, where the story started and how we advertised it isn't the past. It isn't before John bought it. It's after John bought it. Because John bought it, and then he did what, over the years, I've learned John does better than anyone, which is he forgot that money exists. He forgot that there was a budget or a reason he was trying to do this to make money. It wasn't about that. It was about a passion. And if you do it right, John believes and has proven it to be true that if you do it right, people will respect it and you will make money. And if you try to save money and do it cheap, you're just going to make your life harder. And when you have the money to execute on that, like John did, you end up doing what he did with this console, which was basically taking the console, flipping it upside down on the ground, and bringing in Neve engineers who were at the factory back in the day when it was built to say, here's a blank check, fix everything you wish you could have fixed when you were building it originally. And that's what they did. So every capacitor is changed to the capacitor that John picked. All the wiring was swapped out for the wiring that John picked. Different routing or component issues that the consoles had developed over the years were fixed and replaced. So, it's actually weird for me if I go to another studio with the same model console, it takes me an hour to remember how to use the console because the one at Blackbird doesn't work the same. Even the little buttons that turn on and off the EQs are different. There's a second stage of...
Is it different? My daughter was just at East West actually, and her school basically recorded their orchestra over to East West, and I was in that room with the 8078 that's over there, which... I don't know how many 8078s there are, but they probably count them on your finger.
Oh my gosh, I knew I recognized that console. It was in Sigma Sound in Philadelphia where I interned. I had to recall that console a couple of times. Oh my gosh, that's crazy.
So there's just little differences in the way it's patched or the way certain functions work. He has the flying faders set up on the entire board, and right above that, there's these little... automatable digital buttons to pull the EQ in and out and things like that.
Nice.
That not everyone I've been on has. And I don't know if that was a Neve option or if that's something they put in when they modified it.
I don't think that's a Neve option. I don't even know if flying faders were originally an option on that board.
No,
I don't think they were originally. They were later.
Yeah.
But that's totally a John thing. They have a bunch of the flying fader systems actually just in their warehouse. So if he buys a new console, they can just put them in.
Cool.
And he just likes having them there. And then one of the other modifications that was done to that board is there's there's two master buses. There's an A bus and a B bus. The B bus was modified with a large transformer on the output. The details of which were never fully disclosed to me. They're sort of, they're John's secret. But when John uses the board, he prefers that bus. And so when we modeled the plugin, it was our first plugin we ever did was that console. We modeled it using that bus in the chain. That was some of the stuff that I learned because I'd worked on similar consoles, and since I've worked on very, very similar consoles, and they always sound different. They sound a little brighter, a little less, I can't even think of the technical term right now, but less weight to them. And the Studio A console, you put something on it, it always feels like it glues everything together better. Like you don't need to do as much work on it.
Is that
compare it to the Studio E console, which is that's a 68, right?
Yes, the one that's now in Studio E. That console, I'll be honest, I've only used it twice because I haven't been in E much since they put it in. I used E a lot when we first started the company for testing, but it had a 1608 with a sidecar at the time. But the one in E, I don't know what was done to it. It's not original the way the workflow works, but the routing and everything, there's actually a little guide they put in there because no one could ever figure it out. But the few times I've used it, that one, it has that classic Neve grit, but it's much brighter. And the one thing it doesn't seem to have, for me at least, is the sort of clarity. Again, I'm going to kind of move away from technical terms. I haven't spent enough time in E to analyze why, as I have with A. But when I mix on the E console, or when I record on it, I find that I have to do more work to sort of make sure my headroom is right and my clarity of my recording is good. Whereas in A, you pull up the faders. I've been in A before where the console wasn't properly zeroed and the preamps are all over the place, and I pull up the faders without gain staging anything, and it just sounds great. I did a drum recording recently where my gain staging was totally wrong because I pulled up the faders and it sounded so good. I was like, I'm just not touching. Hands off.
Yeah.
Nobody look at the console. We're just going to record like this because it sounds great. And that's something that really only happens in that room for me.
Onto the Neve. You were saying about the one that John's got at Blackbird. You were saying it's less top end and more bottom end on that desk than the other Neve consoles that you've used before. And I'm kind of wondering if he's done a mod on that desk based on current technology, because I'm guessing the original Neve was when they were recording for vinyl, which meant you didn't want too much bottom end because it's not going to fit on the record.
Yeah, I don't know that was necessarily a conscious decision, especially given how much vinyl people that John works with will record, for. Like, a lot of Martina's records have been cut to vinyl. I think, and I don't think it necessarily has less high end as much as it has more low end and a more solid low end than other consoles, because that always can create the perception that it's less bright and less brittle. But I think what it is John, when he went in under the hood of the console, didn't necessarily say, I want it to sound like this. There wasn't a vision of a certain curve or a certain weight. John said, when you built the console, there were all these restrictions. It had to be built in a certain amount of time. It had to cost a certain amount of money. You could only use the capacitors you had access to. You couldn't use the most expensive parts. John said, forget all that. Put the best stuff in here. There's a certain transformer or capacitor that John likes. All the caps were changed with that. And I think the byproduct is that more low end can pass through all the circuits. There's less signal loss. It's just generally a bit quieter and a bit cleaner. And, we're going to make the assumption it's an analog console that's vintage running in a commercial recording studio. So on any given day, it'll be noisier or broken or problematic. Or, when I go in there, I have to find the channels that didn't get broken by the last guy. It's just, the way life is.
Yeah.
One of the beauties of Blackbird is if a channel's broken, I can go in the back, pull a new channel and stick it in because they have so many extras. But I think John kind of just told them, just do it, quote, right. And then we'll see what happens. And then it just sort of worked. And that's the magic of Studio A. It was the first room John built. And so much of that room was not necessarily consciously, I want the low end to be better. It was, I just want it to be done right. And let's see what happens. And it's when somebody says, we're building a room and we're not going to restrict it with how much money we want to spend or any of that. We just want to build the perfect space for making records. You end up sometimes with magic, and that's what Studio A is for me. The big live room with the double height ceiling and the microphones you can hang from the ceiling just sounds like everything came together perfectly. And I don't, and as much as I love Studio D and it's a great room, and objectively, objectively, it's probably a better sounding room in quotes. I don't like it as much. I like A. A is more creative. I can get cooler, different sounds out of A. D, everything sounds like a top 40 radio record. You go in Studio D, the room just sounds like that. And but the A console, I think, is definitely a byproduct of that. I think the fact that we can put more low end on everything, even our vinyl these days can have more low end than it did back in the day, probably helped in people accepting the console for what it is. But I would doubt that John actually intentionally made that change.
It's funny because I just listened to the 40th anniversary of the INXS record Listen Like Thieves, which has been remastered by Giles Martin at Abbey Road. And I listened to it, and it's the one remaster that really works, and it's quite bizarre what Giles has done. Tons of bottom end, tons of top end. There's stuff in there you never heard before. Like, he's actually mixed up a lot of bits and pieces where he's actually pulled the bass guitar right up, which was buried before, and I think it was buried because of vinyl. But it anyway. I'm sort of going off on a tangent. But that is one remaster that works really well, and I think it's because now with technology you can get away with it where you couldn't before.
Yeah, absolutely.
I'd like to ask about one of the vintage consoles or rooms at Blackbird, the Studio G, and that vintage board.
So
Holy
Studio
cow.
G is the room that I used to work in with my boss. It's rented to whoever.
Is it really still running a Pro Control?
I don't know. I mean, that might be the board. So it's a private room. I haven't been in it since 2019 when I quit working for that guy. That particular producer left when COVID hit right after I quit. So now what's his name? Tony Castle is over there now. And he has, his setup. So I don't know. It's very possible. But that's not a public Blackbird room, so I haven't been in there.
Gotcha. It's funny. They have a picture of a Pro Control there, which is like, I think it's
before.
Cool.
That might be 2016. There was another engineer in there before I was in there. Because that was my boss's room, and then I was one room over. There's 3 rooms connected to Studio G. One is like fully built out. The other 2 are kind of like suites, like lounge suites, and one of them was turned into my little mixing room. So
gotcha.
So I know that room super well. But when we were in there, it was empty. We brought our own gear in, so we had the first year we had the box, the API, the box, and then we got rid of that in favor of just an Avocet. Avocet, right? The Crane song.
So So there is an Avocet sitting smack in the middle of the board of the looks like a 32 channel Pro Control, like from 2000.
Yeah, so
basically.
Blackbird used an Avocet in there for years, and then when we moved in, we got rid of it for the box because my boss really wanted it, and then I convinced him eventually to move away from the box, get a really good converter in the Avocet, and then just use that. And so that's what we ended up doing for the rest of the time we were in there.
So he was summing externally with the box, and then did he stop summing externally?
He wasn't even summing externally. That's why I convinced him to get rid of it. He just had the first 2 channels pulled up on the summing mixer, and the only time we used the box was to print to tape and come back to Pro Tools. And then the tape machine that we were borrowing from somebody got sold, and we didn't have a tape machine. So I just said to him, I said, "Look, the box is a very complicated monitor controller. Now let's just get a really good monitor controller and let someone else use the box." So the box belonged to Blackbird. We gave it back to them, and we took the Avocet in place. And that Avocet is actually sitting on my desk right now. It's the one I use in here.
Gotcha.
So
cool.
Yeah.
So what's the workflow is with the boards? Like how you find, like the 8078 is a split board. The some of those APIs in there are inline boards, but I imagine they're not all or any more sessions to tape. So what's the preferred DAW workflow with a big vintage board that you find people using? I've seen plenty of studios where the preferred workflow is one fader up and that's it, like just a bunch of mics and then just return out of the computer back to one fader. Or do you see lots of people just running it like a split with, mics going into the DAW and then the DAW returning multiple faders back? I'm curious.
It's very, and I can only answer this to the extent of the sessions I've been in. I was never an assistant at Blackbird, or an engineer there, so I don't have the session experience with a lot of the engineers. But the ones I have watched work in there, or the sessions I've been on, it's very dependent. I've seen 3 ways mainly. The way I do it, I use the board as a front end to Pro Tools. So all of my recording tracks come out on big faders because I like using the big fader to send to Pro Tools. It's a weird thing, but I like to do that. I send that to Pro Tools, and then I just take 2 tracks on the other end of the board as line input returned from Pro Tools that are just pulled up for my left, right.
So 2 tracks back. Yep.
Just 2
tracks. And then do you do headphones
and
then headphones right off the mics, or do you do headphones from within Pro Tools?
No, the headphones come off the cues in the console. So Blackbird in both A and D has a setup where you just put all the cues up to 0, and then they have not DB25, I forget the connector, but a multi-pin connector that goes to the back of a rack with a Mackie mixer in it, and each artist mixes their own thing.
Those are the mics going to the cues, but what about and then just playback, and then playback goes to the
Pro Tools. I just put it on 2 tracks of that Mackie, so I'll send it to like Q14, 15, 16 on those consoles because there's 16 channels.
So then how do you deal with Pro Tools as far as like, Pro Tools is going to monitor through and you're going to get a double because you have the board feeding the headphones?
I won't send the full 2 track coming out to the artist unless I have to, in which case I've already kind of thought about what's going there. I'll take a send out of Pro Tools. So let's say I wanted to send my metronome from Pro Tools out, I'll take a send, put it on a different track of the console, send that to a different fader on the little Mackie mixer.
Gotcha.
So everything always has its own place. And then, that's my personal workflow. I have seen engineers do a full split on a console. The API console in Studio D is so huge. It's inline, but it's 96 channels. So a lot of engineers will just use the first bunch of channels to send, and then instead of doing inline, they'll just come back on the other side of the board and use them to.
So they'll run the inline board like a split board, basically.
I've seen that done at least once or twice. I'm sure people do it other ways. The thing with Blackbird that's so interesting for me, up until Blackbird, I always worked at studios where the producers and engineers were mostly in-house. A couple exceptions. I did some work at Milk Boy in Philly. It was a little different, but I didn't spend much time there. But like I worked at a place called Forge just outside of Philadelphia, and there was a house engineer who was the engineer on just about every session. It wasn't the kind of place where a producer came in with his engineer. Blackbird is that old school place. A lot of times the room's just rented by the artist, and no Blackbird staff is in there other than the assistant who's just there to make sure that nobody breaks anything and the patch bay works right.
Yeah.
And
have you ever seen this one? Like, so insert send to Pro Tools, insert return out of Pro Tools, back to the board, headphones. So
not here, but I did in Philly twice. I remember two different studios that did it that way, and it always threw me off, but it was cool. It worked. But it took me like a day the first time I saw it to be like, what is happening? How is this working?
Well, you got to have an HDX system. Yeah, you have to have an HDX system to make it super low latency. Because at least like when you return it off to the right side of the board and you don't send the headphones out, you could be running like Pro Tools on a native thing and it wouldn't matter. But as soon as you run it through like that, you got to have like zero latency. So you got to have an HDX system.
What was the purpose of that routing?
It feels really natural because your preamps, it's sort of like pseudo inline, right? The preamp goes in, or the mic goes into the preamp. It goes right to Pro Tools. The track of Pro Tools goes straight out. So you're not mixing in Pro Tools. Every track of Pro Tools has its own output and it goes right to the faders.
Oh, it's just acting
and
as
then
a
on the
tape deck.
faders, and then you got your aux sends going to headphones and it feels very tape-ish.
Got it.
Well, now we've sort of like gone off on a tangent, which is unusual for us, I've got to say.
No, it never happens.
We're supposed to be talking about plugins, KIT's plugins.
Oh, that's
well,
right.
we're building up to the reason why someone would bother making plugins emulating analog gear, right? Like, why bother,
the twist
right?
there. I like the twist there, George. Nice one. Yeah. So with your plugins, what makes your plugins different, and are they based exclusively on Studio A at Blackbird?
What makes them unique, there's a couple things, and it's developed over the years. So our early plugins, the underlying software was relatively commoditized, for lack of a better word. It was, the same technology any other top-level plugin company was going to use to make a plugin. It was strictly about, we want to capture the sound and the vibe of Blackbird, and John specifically. By the time we actually went to build our first plugin, we'd been doing it for about a year.
Is it Juice?
And I'd gotten to know John very well.
Is it Juice that you're using, basically?
Juice, so everything's built in Juice. Yeah. But we don't use the stock Juice modules for anything. It's all C++ code our developers, right?
Sure, of course.
We use the Juice framework just to make our lives easier. But the first plugin, the first couple plugins were built using more sort of traditional technologies. As time's gone on, and I'll get into it in a second, as time gone on, we have sort of developed our own proprietary technology that's gotten more and more complicated to achieve new and different things or just better sounds, specifically for different types of gear. But with the first plugin, what the goal was basically in our business pitch to our investors was the technology is relatively commoditized. We're not going to invent something new. We're going to take IP like HBO does. We're going to take Blackbird's IP and we're going to present it to people because it in and of itself is unique. And that's why we picked the Studio A console to start. It had the unique benefit that it was COVID. I couldn't come back down to Nashville. I was stuck up in New York because I was in New York when lockdown hit with my family. And John could ship me a channel of the console to start playing with and start taking measurements off of. And then by the time lockdown lifted and I could travel, I flew down with a mask and all the, nobody near me in the room. And we took more samples of the console and measurements off the circuits and all that. But that was the idea, and that's what we went for. And it still to this day is in the ethos of what KIT Plugins as a sub-brand of our new brand NoiseHub does, which is we want to do analog modeling, but we don't want to just be scientifically perfect. particularly care what a plugin looks like on a graph if it doesn't sound and work well, right? Like you tell me it lines up perfectly with the original gear, but when I go to use it, I don't feel like it's the original gear. That graph is useless to me. That's not going to make my song sound better or make me like it. So we really wanted sort of what I always said is what happens both, what do I hear and what do I feel when I turn a knob? When I do that on the plugin, it needs to feel the same. That's what matters more than anything. Even if it means on a graph we're slightly different, it doesn't matter to me. There are other companies that'll build, scientific heritage models just for the sake of doing it. That's not us. We're here to make plugins that are more, for the creative, for the people actually making records every day. And
so you kind of emulate and then you deviate or, kind of work from there as a baseline to then
as needed. Yeah. So the final step of every Blackbird plugin is very simple, very tedious, but very simple. John and I will play with the plugin profusely over the course of anywhere from a couple weeks to months and go back and forth with changes that we feel it needs compared to the original gear. So we will sit there for hours together, sometimes separately with the gear and the plugin and playing with it in a session. Put a vocal through it, play with it, put a drums through it, play with it, put another sound through it, play with it. And John will send me a text, or if I'm in the room, he'll tell me, 2K sounds a little off. It's a little harsh. The distortion doesn't quite feel right. And we just keep tweaking and iterating, just like you would with an artist on a song, right? If you're the artist and you have a mix engineer, you're the producer and you have a mix engineer, you tell him it feels a little bright, it feels a little harsh. If you want to be on the more creative side, it feels too blue, make it more red, right? We've all heard your comments before. But my job is to have these sort of creative conversations with John, and then I translate that to technological or scientific. Hey, here's what we need to change. My engineers change it. They give it back to me. If I think it's in the right direction, I bring it back to John. And that process is what makes our plugins really unique and magical because, something like Martina's Fairchild, which was one of the longer and harder projects we've taken on in the history of the company because it's not only something that was a challenge from a technological standpoint, we had to develop some new technology to handle it, some new, sort of mathematical algorithms, but also such a weight on me and on John to get it right because there's something about that unit is so unique, it's so special, and it's
the Fairchild specifically.
Her Fairchild specifically, and one of the things. So John over the years has owned. The number changes depending on who you ask, so I don't have an accurate number, but somewhere between 15 and 25 different Fairchilds have been in his possession and ownership over the years. There was a point where there was 27 channels of Fairchild at Blackbird at the same time between the 660s and 670s.
You just build a whole console out of Pultex and Fairchilds.
Exactly. They could have. A lot of those have since, been sold because nobody needs that many Fairchilds, and John wanted to buy other pieces of gear and make sure that things get used. But there's one Fairchild over all of those that he thought sounded better, and that's the one that he put into her vocal rack that they used to tour with. They don't tour with it anymore, but now it's every time she records it gets used. And what kind of makes it special?
With a Fairchild, wow.
Yeah, it's not available. Like you can rent Blackbird, and that is not something that most people can get access to or use. It's locked away in a back room and not in one of the like mic lockers where you can see it. It's hidden in the back in someone's office. And a very few, I've heard of one or two artists that asked John personally for access to it that he said yes. And but it's few and far between. And so, when we went to do that 660, we had to get it right. It had to be perfect. John started using our plugins to mix Martina live on the Yamaha consoles now. And that was a big step because John had a fully analog mixing rig live too and did not want to deviate from it. And once we came out with the Neve channel from Studio A, he started using the Yamaha consoles and running 16 channels of the BBN 105, which is our original Neve channel, to mix Martina live. So when we did the Fairchild, I said, well, I got to get it right because he's going to use it and it's got to feel and sound like her unit. And that's the other thing you ask about, kind of coming back to the point. Sorry for the segue, but we can bring it back now. What makes our plugins unique? There's a lot of Fairchild plugins out there. And I knew that there'd be more. I mean, I didn't know who would do one, but as it is, Unfairchild came out with their plugin a month after mine came out.
Yeah, I was going to say, did you guys come up with like a fun name for it? Like the Puke Child and the Unfair Child and the...
So we were going to come up with a funny name. We had some options, and we just decided from a branding standpoint it wasn't on brand for us. So we kept it boring. It's just the F66 and the F67. But was something that we said, like, we don't want to build the same Fairchild everyone else builds. John has a 670 sitting in Studio A. He has an original one. Well, actually, it's not there anymore. The original is now in rentals, so you have to ask for it. It's not just there for anyone to play with. But he has a couple original 670s. He has another 660 that sound more like every other Fairchild I've heard. I mean, every Fairchild's unique, but there is a baseline. Martinez just sounds different. It's, in my opinion, I'm going to use my own words here, but it's a bit warmer. It's a bit softer sounding. It's smoother, and it does have a far more dramatic low frequency boost curve inherently when you turn it on than any other Fairchild we tested. And so we said, look, let's be unique. Let's build Martinez Fairchild because nobody has that. Everyone has a Fairchild, and that's great. I mean, I still use some of the Fairchilds from my competitors when I'm mixing because I don't have a standard Fairchild. I have Martinez, which has that low-end boost and that kind of slightly less aggressive attack on it, but it makes it unique. And that's what we try to do. John and I try to pick a piece of gear that is unique to Blackbird, whether being something no one else has, like the Motown EQ, which several other companies have come out with plugins, but not of the same circuit version that we have. The one we have is the original.
It's so funny. I was in a Sapphire group meeting, and they had a guy who was like, literally, he put the plaster on the walls at Motown.
Yep.
And he was saying how that when they moved Motown from Detroit to LA, and they ordered like 15 of those EQs, and the first batch came out with the 60 cycle hum in them, and he was pretty sure that like those like got emulated. Like at first or whatever, because like they're out there and like people are like, I got Motown EQ and the history's lost, and this one has like this like bad circuit in it when they first botched it.
There were 3 versions of the circuit. There was an original version which were handmade by the engineers at Motown locally, and that's why. So John has 2 of those original ones. The front panels are different thicknesses, and the numbers don't all quite line up because they were handmade. They were not made in a shop that did this. The front panels probably came from an auto body shop down the street or something, scrap metal. Then there was a second version where they actually said, okay, this is the circuit. Let's build them right. Let's have an audio company make them. And they made a few of those. Nobody knows exactly how many. And then very soon after those were designed, they moved to LA. And the first batch in LA came out with the 60 cycle hum. Right. Those were quickly thrown in a closet, and they eventually made somewhere, I've heard different numbers, but between 100 and 500 of them total over the years. And those have circulated. They have a silver face, they have a ratcheted knob, but they're not the original one. That's on all the famous Motown records from Detroit. The original one has a fluid knob, and it has a black face on it. It's not a silver face. And so when we put out our plugin, there was a lot of pushback from people who said, first of all, UA, of course, put their plugin out a week after us. I don't know how that always happens, but it always does. Somebody else builds the same plugin or similar plugin to what we're building. But UA modeled one of the second versions, the versions with the ratcheted knob, which is the same thing that most of the modern hardware clones that are made by the hardware clone companies are based off of. And, and I've had some disagreements with some people who say there are a few of those clones that are based on the original circuit. I will say that. I don't know exactly which ones, but I know I've seen at least one. I don't know what company made it, but I looked inside and the circuit matched the one that we did. But I had a fight with somebody at one of the companies at NAMM 2 years ago. I won't name a company, but they claimed they had the original unit, and they said, your plugin's wrong, it should be ratcheted. And I said, if you think that, then you don't have an original unit. We got into a whole disagreement over it. But, the one thing I have, and maybe I'm too trusting of the people I trust, but I trust John implicitly. And John had, back in the day, an original engineer from Motown come and look at the circuit and verify, yep, those are the ones we built. And it's one of the first 26 or whatever. And John has 2 of them, of course, because if John has one, there is only one. That is the rule with people who are friends with John. Which
actually the engineer at that group told us that they pulled the circuit from a graphic EQ that had red knobs on it, and they basically pulled that circuit exactly.
It is.
Was that what it was?
It's a Longevin EQ, but then they didn't have all the right. The story I was told is they didn't have all the right components. I don't know if this is true. I want to caveat that, but the story I was told, they didn't have all the right components, so some of the center frequencies and boost and cut levels are slightly off from a Longevin because they didn't have the exact parts. So they used what they had, which would check out from what we've seen when we did measurements. The biggest thing for those original units that the newer ones don't do as well, what they still do, is there's no distortion. there is almost no measurable total harmonic distortion in the.
Correct me if it's a graphic EQ with it's a passive, and then it's got a gain at the end. It's passive, right? Yeah.
Yes.
So how, it's, well, I mean, I don't know. There's not a lot of graphic passives out there. Like the only one I can really think of is there's an Avalon that's got one, and I guess that NTI EQ is also a graphic passive. That night, I guess there are some.
Yeah, there's a few. I think most of them are honestly inspired by either the Longevin or the Motown. But yeah, that's sort of the history. But that, again, bringing it sort of back to the question Andrew asked, for us, that's how we try to differentiate ourselves, is go for pieces of gear we know no one have, or pieces of gear that are either modified or the workflow is unique. We did the 2254 compressor recently. Again, I had a meeting with John. We decide every plugin together, and we sat down and we said, look, we want to do another compressor. The Fairchild's great, but it's not the most versatile unit, right? Fairchild does what a Fairchild does. Even Martinez is sort of stuck in that box. Let's do something a little on the other side of the spectrum that's more versatile so that we can start sort of advertising, hey, you can do an entire mix using our plugins now. You don't need to use someone else's plugin if you don't want to, if you want to keep it old and analog. And we picked the 2254 over anything else because it's a bit more unique, but also John has a version that no one else has modeled. Not that they're not out there, but John had a different revision than the ones done by Universal Audio and Plugin Alliance. And so I said, look, it's something a little different. The transformer is a different wind. They changed the design of the transformer between the revisions. And then we added things for John's workflow. So for example, just the way the attack and release work. John has two of them, and like most of the vintage gear, we've found more and more as we do vintage gear, the two units will be further apart than our plugin and the unit we modeled it after are at the end, because they're just so different. But we picked out of the 4 2254s John had, we picked the one he liked the best, and then he kind of walked us through why he liked it, and we made sure that we put that in the plugin. And what he liked about the one that we ended up picking is the way it distorted. When it distorted and the way it distorted versus the other ones was more musical in John's mind. And he never quite quantified it for me, but I just said, okay, you like this one because it's more musical and it's distorting, right? We'll model it. And over the years, we've now developed some proprietary technology. We've expanded how we build plugins. So when we first started out, we were not component modeling most of the circuit, if any. Nowadays, depending on the piece of gear, we could do a lot more component modeling. But our approach is always, let's find the best way to achieve our goal. I'm not going to sit here and say I always component model, because I think sometimes component modeling is not the answer for a great result.
When you component model, do you have to take the piece out and model that component and measure? I mean, it could even be like, hey, here's a 60-year-old tube and it hasn't, maybe you don't keep 60-year-old tubes in there, but do you have to literally take the components out of the unit and then, model? Because one method is just modeling the unit as a black box.
When we do component modeling, we basically, and sometimes we do a hybrid. We have not to date done a plugin that is 100% component. We have some that are very close to that, but there's always something that we do that's not component modeling, because during that tuning process, we inevitably find ourselves saying, look, we need to add an EQ curve or a boost or a cut or change the harmonic distortion. And rather than trying to figure out, well, okay, from a circuit theory standpoint, how am I going to modify this circuit? We just inevitably end up doing some sort of black box modeling attached to what was a component model. But to answer your question, we have to go in and we have to measure, if not every component, different parts of circuits. So for the 2254, parts are component modeled, parts are not, parts are black box. And then some parts are a hybrid where we didn't go in and go, capacitor, transformer, whatever. But we took the beginning and end of a piece of the circuit. For example, we took the beginning and end of the detector circuit. We run a bunch of sound through it, a bunch of signals through it at the beginning and end, and we pulled it all out on a scope with memory. And we send those files off to an engineer in Germany that we work with who knows how to turn that into the model, and then he sends it back, and my engineers here in Nashville put it all together.
Is it pretty similar to you're running sweeps and impulses through it? Is it a bit like a...
So that's how we do black box. We run test signals through, but what I'm talking about is actually just running a scope. So it's running, I don't remember what type of, sometimes it's running a sine electrical signal, but it's all in the electrical domain. And mainly what we were looking at there was the release circuit, right? It's a program dependent compressor, which is probably the hardest compressor to model out of just generic types of compressors. Program dependency makes it a lot harder. And of course, we chose to do 2 program dependent compressors as our first 2 compressors. So we don't make our lives easy over here. But what we did is we actually took the measurement of the release circuit. So we could see how it reacted to the incoming signals and how long it took for it to recover and what curve it took on that recover. And then we send that along with a schematic over to this engineer in Germany that we work with who knows how to sort of put it all together. And he put together the schematic exactly the way it said to. And it wasn't identical because the schematic doesn't take into account the fact that, like you said, it's a 40-year-old part. Yeah. And by the way, those 2254s, they only fix them if they break. Yeah. Because those things, you open them up and it's a bunch of cards like this with the pieces are interstacked. Yeah. Like imagine. This. So you can't get in there. I mean, we had one that was broken and I brought it over to the tech shop and they laughed at me. And I said, what? And they go, put it over there in the corner. We'll get to it eventually, but it's not happening right now because that is a week of work. And so we ended up, luckily it wasn't the one John liked. John liked a different one, but eventually they did fix it. It's just, they're so hard to work on. So at some point, because with the Fairchild, you open it up, there's a lot of open space. Yeah. And we were able to get in there and probe it. We couldn't get in and probe individual components on the 2254 without taking it apart, which, given that John only has one he likes, I'm not taking it apart. Because if I put it back together and it sounds different, it's dead.
The 2254 you're talking about, the ones that you got at Blackbird, they're the square ones, is that correct?
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
They were like mounted in the board up on the meter bridge. Or no, they weren't on
exactly.
the meter bridge. Yeah, were they on the meter bridge?
They weren't on the meter bridge. They were below.
They were just below it. Yeah, in the center. Yeah.
I've never actually seen them mounted in the console, so I'm trying to remember the pictures I've seen. But John has 4 racked in pairs of 2. 2 are revision A, which just have the on-off switch. They don't have the 3-way switch for the limiter. Like, they don't have the fast-slow. And then he has 2 that are, I forget the revision letter, but they have the fast-slow on the limiter.
Because I've got one here. I'm looking at it, actually. But mine's a newer one, a rack mount, 19-inch rack mount of the 2254.
But yours is a, what, Heritage? Or who emulated yours? Who's the...
AMS Neve.
Oh, it is AMS. Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, they remake them in that 19-inch rack just to make it convenient. But the ones we modeled, they look like our plugins, so they're 2 next to each other. And yeah, they're great. I mean, they're great units. They're very specific. They do what they do. Yeah. But they're kind of on the opposite side of the spectrum, in my opinion, from a Fairchild. And John agreed with that, which is why we went for it.
Yeah. So with your plugins, do you actually make note that these are from Blackbird, and that's what's unique about them?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, they're like
the names of the plugins are
special history, pedigree to them.
Exactly. And every plugin is labeled with it. So we call them BB105 or BB whatever, but it's the Blackbird Neve 105 is what the BBN 105 stands for. Yeah. Or in the case of the 2254, it's the Blackbird, the BBN 54.
Yeah,
is the name of the plugin. So these are sold as Blackbird plugins, and specifically because it's not the 2254, it's John's 2254.
Yeah,
that's the point.
And the whole thing about this vintage, this is what we've always talked about in this show before when we've talked about plugins and sort of mic modeling and stuff like that. It's like, well, maybe the U47 or the 2254 or the 1073 or whatever that you did an emulation of or a plugin of, it will sound completely different to another one. So if you're used to using one of those, sort of vintage bits of kit, and then you take the plugin with you, it's going to sound totally different probably.
Absolutely. And, a fun story that, again, I won't name the company just to not throw anyone under a bus, but I don't want to start a fight. But there's a certain company, a big plugin company, that before I got here and started working with John, they rented a piece of gear from Blackbird without telling them they were going to model it. They took it. They modeled it, they sent it back, and it was found about a year later, after that plugin had come out and everything, that the piece of gear was completely wrong inside. That the whole thing was hooked up wrong. It sounded completely out of whack. And
they took it apart to this day, and didn't return it properly?
No, they didn't take it apart. They took it. John bought it from somebody who had messed it up. And they never figured it out.
Oh, they emulated that. Right, yeah.
So they emulated the wrong thing. And to this day, everybody goes, why does that one company's plugin not work the way it should?
Yeah,
it sounds wrong. It doesn't, like, you turn knobs and they do slightly weird things, and
they got the one special variant. They just need to market it as such.
Yeah.
Well, the problem is they can't say it was John's, because even though we figured out that it was John's, because once the plugin came out, it was messed up. One of John's engineers went, "Hey, they modeled our piece of gear because ours is broken in that exact same way." And eventually John fixed it and sold it to someone else. But you'd be surprised how many times that happens. Every piece of gear we model sits on Richard's desk. Richard's the head tech here at Blackbird, and he's sort of a legend. He gets to go through everything before we touch it. And if he tells us it's wrong, but John likes it, that's fine, but we know it's wrong. But we never sample it. We're starting work on a new plugin now that we thought sounded great. John thought it sounded great, but something seemed a little off. We sent it to Richard. He comes back, he goes, "It's fucked." That's the word he used. He said the whole thing's a mess. None of the measurements were going to be right. It was going to be a disaster. So yeah, it's the thing at the end of the day with any of these plugins is, now that I've been making them for years and I really understand sort of the dirty secrets of the industry, it's all about what you can do with it, which is why I've leaned even harder with my company into, I want to make plugins that make me as a creative feel like I want to use it. When I go to mix on the weekend now for fun, which is what I do in my spare time now that it's not my job, I want to pull up the plugin and have the emotional reaction that I have when I have the physical piece of gear, right? You buy a $5,000 compressor and you start using it, you feel something. It's not just a sound. It's not just a tool, There's an emotional connection to that piece of gear. I want the plugins to have that same thing. I walk into Studio A and I sit down at the console and I have a certain feeling, and I want my plugin to, as best it can. Look, I'm never going to recreate the feeling of a $10 million recording studio. You can't. But if I can get you 1% of that in that plugin, then I've done my job. And I think other companies, and it's fine that they do this, but they have the approach of, it's going to sound exactly like the thing on a piece of paper. We're going to put it on a graph. It's going to line up perfectly, and you're all going to be happy. And a lot of times they just feel sterile to me, but it's all about how you use it.
Yeah.
Just because I like a plugin doesn't mean someone else will or won't.
Yeah, it's funny, we talk about getting things that are broken when you're trying to do an emulation. Or the story, we've probably bored our listeners with this one on numerous occasions, but one of our sponsors, Austrian Audio, came up the ashes of AKG in Vienna.
Right.
So they took over that factory. But all the guys that were doing R&D on the C12 capsule, they were going to rebuild. This backstory was, I remember meeting Martin, who is the CEO of Austrian Audio, and we talked about the R&D that went into making this capsule, and he got a whole bunch of C12s from everybody that had one, Stevie Wonders, a whole bunch of famous C12s that arrived. And it was funny because he said to me, interestingly, Quincy Jones' favorite microphone is the C12 that he's got, but it was broken.
It's broken, yeah.
But he just loved the sound of the broken C12.
And it's common. There's a microphone here at Blackbird that I don't know if John's even used it or knows anything about it, to be honest, because it's not one of the ones he uses. But it's a 251. Yeah, I think it's a 251. But it's a relatively modern tube telephone microphone that somebody clearly dropped at some point, and the tube is not properly seated because it distorts way sooner than it should in terms of headroom. But it sounds great, and there's actually a little sticker that says "Do not fix" on it now, because a bunch of engineers, including myself, has told the techs, "Don't fuck this up.
Yeah, this is good.
This is special.
Don't unfuck this up.
Don't unfuck it up." Yeah.
Oh my God.
But yeah, there's plugins are such a it's such a weird space. People get so worked up over it, and I've started just telling people, the thing is, don't get worked up over it. Like, a lot of guys will probably get on a podcast like this and say, my company makes the best thing in the world, and I obviously like my plugins better than anyone else's. I wouldn't make them if I didn't.
Yep.
But I fully recognize that there's a reason all these other companies exist, and there's a reason people use them. And look, you go on my computer, I guarantee you're going to see a lot of manufacturers of plugins that are not mine. And some of them are for testing, but a lot of them are there because I use them.
Yeah.
Because they have a purpose. And I reach for my plugin when I need a certain thing, and I reach for theirs when I need a different thing. And that's sort of the beauty of the plugin world, is you really can have all of the color palettes and all the different tools. And just because I like Martino's Fairchild better on certain applications, there are times I reach for a different Fairchild plugin. Or just same way at Blackbird, sometimes I have her Fairchild and I'll grab one of the other ones from storage and pull it out because it does have a different sound. And that's sort of the point. That's the reason me and John started the company, is, we wanted to sort of share the color palettes with the world.
Yeah, just because you work for Crayola and they have 64 crayons doesn't mean you can only color in 64 crayon colors.
Yeah, that's why you mix them together. Yeah, I didn't realize that John was actually involved with KIT, so that's an interesting revelation that from this podcast. Also, talking about interesting revelations, one we can't even talk about, but I know it's going to be announced in July, and that's about all I can say at this point. But what I've seen, it's going to be very, very interesting indeed.
We might have to revisit this, I think.
Yeah, I think so, because, Anyway, on that note, Matthew, thank you very much for joining us. It's a big tease. Well, we have to get you back to talk about the July announcement.
Absolutely.
Lovely. Well, thanks for joining us, and it's really enlightening. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
Yeah, man, thank you.
You've been had.
Well, that was fun. Is it over?
The Pro Audio Suite, with thanks to Tribooth and Austrian Audio. Recorded using Source Connect. Edited by Andrew Peters and mixed by Robbo. Got your own audio issues? Just ask Robbo.com. With tech support from George The Tech Whittam. Don't forget to subscribe to the show and join in the conversation on our Facebook group. To leave a comment, suggest a topic, or just say g'day, drop us a note at our website, proaudiosuite.com.